I was born September 16th, 1843, on a farm in Otter Creek Precinct, Jersey County, Illinois. I was living with my parents in the little old log house where I was born when the Civil War began. When I was a boy at home, I was to some extent a spoiled child. I was exceedingly particular and finicky about my food. Fat meat I abhorred and wouldn't touch it. And on the other hand, when we had chicken to eat, the gizzard was claimed by me as my sole and exclusive tidbit, and Leander always got it. The day after the Battle of Bull Run, Congress passed a law authorizing Mr. Lincoln to call for 500,000 three-year volunteers. It was under this law, supplemented by authority from the Secretary of War, that the regiment was organized in which I subsequently enlisted. I was then only a boy, but somehow I felt that the war was going to be a long one. I had some talk with my father on the subject. He was a strong Union man and in sympathy with my feelings, but I could see that naturally he dreaded the idea of his boy going to the war, with the result that maybe he would be killed or come home a cripple for life. But I gave him to understand that when they began organizing a regiment in our vicinity, and which would contain a fair proportion of my neighbor boys and acquaintances, I intended then to volunteer. It was simply intolerable to think that I could stay at home among the girls and be pointed out at by the soldier boys as a stay-at-home coward. When I heard that Wallace was to be the first sergeant of Captain Reddish's company, I made up my mind right then that I would enlist in that company, and told my father I was going to do so. He listened in silence, with his eyes fixed on the ground. Finally he said, "Well, Leander, if you think it's your duty to go, I shall make no objection. But you're the only boy I now have at home big enough to work, so I wish you'd put it off until we get the wheat sowed and the corn gathered. Then, if you're still of the same mind, it'll be all right." I felt satisfied that the regiment would not leave for the front until after we had done that work, so I at once consented to my father's request. And one evening I told my parents I intended to go to Carrollton the next day, and maybe would come back a soldier. Early next morning, which was Monday, January 6th, 1862, I saddled and bridled Bill, the little black mule, and struck out. Carrollton was about 20 miles from our home, almost due north, and the road ran mainly through big woods, with an occasional farm on either side of the road. I reached the camp about the middle of the afternoon, went to the quarters of Reddish's company, found Enoch Wallace, and told him I had come to enlist. He took me to Captain Reddish, gave me a short introduction to him, and told him my business. The old captain gave me a hearty greeting, and was so plain, kind, and natural in his manner and talk that I took a liking to him at once. He told me that the first step necessary was to be examined by the regimental surgeon as to my physical fitness. So we at once went to the surgeon's tent. I had previously heard all sorts of stories as to the thoroughness of this examination, that sometimes the prospective recruits had to strip stark naked and jump about in order to show that their limbs were perfect. But I was agreeably disappointed in that regard. The surgeon at that time was a fat, jolly old doctor by the name of Leonidas Clemens. I was about scared to death when the captain presented me to him and requested him to examine me. I reckon the good old doctor saw I was frightened, and he began laughing heartily and saying some kind things about my general appearance. He requested me to stand up straight, then gave me 2 or 3 little sort of love taps on the chest, turned me round, ran his hands over my shoulders, back, and limbs, laughing and talking all the time, then whirled me to the front, and rendered judgment on me as follows: "Ah, Captain Reddish, I only wish you had 100 such fine boys as this one. He's all right and good for the service." I drew a long breath and felt much relieved. Then we went to the adjutant's tent. There I signed something, and was duly sworn in. then to the quartermaster's tent, where I drew my clothing. I got behind a big bale of stuff, took off my citizen's apparel, and put on my soldier clothes then and there, and didn't I feel proud! Next morning, after an early breakfast, I pulled out for home, with my 2 days' furlough in my pocket. I was accompanied by John Jobson, one of Reddish's company, and who had enlisted about a month previous. He had obtained a short furlough for some purpose or other, and had hired a horse on which to make the trip. Prior to his enlistment he had been working as a farm hand for Sam Dougherty, one of our nearest neighbors, and I had become well acquainted with him. I well remember our high spirits on this journey home. We were young, glowing with health, and overflowing with liveliness and animation. There was a heavy snow on the ground, but the sky was clear, and the air was keen and bracing. Occasionally, when we would strike a stretch of level road, we would loose all the buttons of our overcoats save the top one, put the gad to our steeds, and waving our caps with our long coat tails streaming in the wind, would yell like Comanches and let on that we were making a cavalry charge. I have no doubt that we believed we presented a most terror-striking appearance. In the summer of 1863, while we were stationed near Vicksburg, Jobson was taken seriously ill, and was put on a transport to be taken to a general hospital at Mound City, Illinois. He died en route on the boat, and was hastily buried in a sandbar at the mouth of White River. The changing currents of the mighty Mississippi have long since swallowed up that sandbar, and with it all that may have been left of the mortal remains of poor Jobson. I reached home sometime in the afternoon, relieved Bill of his equipments, put him in the stable, and fed him. No one was stirring about outside, and I walked into the house unannounced. My mother was seated in an old rocking chair, engaged in sewing. She looked up, saw me in the uniform of a soldier, and she knew what that meant. Her work dropped in her lap. She covered her face with her hands, and the tears gushed through her fingers, and she trembled in her chair with the intensity of her emotions. There was no sobbing or other vocal manifestation of feeling, but her silence made her grief seem all the more impressive. I was distressed and didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, and walked out into the kitchen, thence back to the barn. There I met father, who had come in from some outdoor work. He looked at me gravely, but with an impassive countenance, and merely remarked, "Well, I reckon you done right." Next morning everybody seemed more cheerful, and I had much to say at breakfast about things at Camp Carrollton. On the expiration of my furlough, I promptly reported at the camp, and entered on my duties as a soldier. The absorbing duty was the drill, and that was persistent, and consumed the most of the time. I knew nothing about it when I enlisted, and had never seen any except on the previous Monday afternoon. The system we had then was called Hardee's Infantry Tactics. It was simple and easily learned. The main things required were promptness, care, and close attention. All day long, somewhere in the camp, could be heard the voice of some officer calling, "Left, left, left, right, left," to his squad or company, to guide them in the cadence of the step. Our fare consisted of light bread, coffee, fresh meat at some meals and salt meat at others, Yankee beans, rice, onions, and Irish and sweet potatoes, with stewed dried apples occasionally for supper. The salt meat, as a rule, was pickled pork and fat side meat, which latter table comfort the boys called sow belly. We got well acquainted with that before the war was over. On the grub question, I will say now that the great standbys of the Union soldiers during the war, at least those of the Western armies, were coffee, sow belly, Yankee beans, and hardtack. It took us, of course, some time to learn how to cook things properly, especially the beans, but after we had learned how, we never went back on the above-named old friends. But the death of many a poor boy, especially during our first 2 or 3 months in the field, is chargeable to the bad cooking of his food. At Carrollton the jolliest time of the day was from the close of dress parade until taps sounded "lights out." There was then a good deal of what you might call prairie dogging. That is, the boys would run around and visit at the quarters of other companies. And oh, how they would sing! All sorts of patriotic songs were in vogue then, and what was lacking in tone we made up in volume. General Grant gained his great victory at Fort Donelson on February 16, 1862, and the news reached us a few days later. The boys talked about it with feelings of mingled exultation and mortification. Exultation, of course, over the glorious victory, but mortification in regard to its effects and consequences on our future military career. We all thought, from the officers down, that now the war would end, that we would see no actual service and never fire a shot, that we would be discharged and go home just little trundle-bed soldiers and have to sit around and hear the other sure-enough warriors tell the stories of actual war and fighting. If we only had known, we were borrowing unnecessary trouble, as we found out later. Sometime during the last of February, the welcome news was given out from regimental headquarters that we were soon to leave Camp Carrollton. Our first objective point was to be St. Louis, Missouri, and what next, nobody knew. Definite orders for the movement were issued later, and it then occurred to us that possibly all our recent apprehensions about not seeing any fighting were somewhat premature. The regiment arrived at Jerseyville about sunset. The word had gone out all through the country that Fry's regiment was leaving for the front, and the country people had come to town from miles around in their farm wagons to have one last look and bid us good-bye. The regiment, in column by companies, company distance, marched up the main street running south, and on reaching the center of the little town, we wheeled into line, dressed on the colors, and stood at attention. The sidewalks were thronged with the country people, all intently scanning the lines, each little family group anxiously looking for their boy, brother, husband, or father, as the case may have been. I was satisfied that my parents were somewhere among the crowd of spectators, for I had specially written them as to when we would pass through Jerseyville. I was in the front rank, and kept my face rigidly fixed to the front, but glanced as best I could up and down the sidewalk, trying to locate father and mother. Suddenly I saw them, as they struggled to the edge of the walk, not more than 10 feet from me. I had been somewhat dreading the meeting, and the parting that was to come. I remembered the emotion of my mother when she first saw me in my uniform, and I feared that now she might break down altogether. But there she stood, her eyes fixed on me intently, with a proud and happy smile on her face. You see, we were a magnificent-looking body of young fellows, somewhere between 800 and 900 strong. Our uniforms were clean and comparatively new, and our faces were ruddy and glowing with health. I reckon it was a somewhat inspiring sight to country people like those who, with possibly very few exceptions, had never seen anything like that before. Anyhow, my mother was evidently content and glad to see me there, under the shadow of the flag, and going forth to fight for the old Union, instead of then being sneaking around at home, like some great hulking boys in our neighborhood who were of Copperhead sympathies and parentage. Arrangements had been made to quarter the regiment that night in different public buildings in the town, and the companies were soon marched to their respective places. Company D had been assigned to the Baptist church, and there my parents and I met, and had our final interview. They were 9 miles from home in the old farm wagon. The roads, in the main, were through dense woods, and across ridges and hollows. The short winter day was drawing to a close, and night approaching, so our farewell talk was necessarily brief. Our parting was simple and unaffected, without any display of emotion by anybody, but Mother's eyes looked unusually bright, and she didn't linger after she had said, "Good-bye, Leander." As for my father, he was an old North Carolinian, born and reared among the Cherokee Indians at the base of the Great Smoky Mountains. and with him and all other men of his type any yielding to womanish feelings was looked on as almost disgraceful. His farewell words were few and concise, and spoken in his ordinary tone and manner. He then turned on his heel and was gone. Early the next morning we pulled out for Alton on the Mississippi River, but we did not have to march much that day. The country people around and near Jerseyville turned out in force with their farm wagons and insisted on hauling us to Alton, and their invitations were accepted with pleasure. A few miles north of Alton we passed what in those days, and may be yet, a popular and celebrated school for girls, called the Monticello Female Seminary. The girls had heard of our coming and were all out by the side of the road, 100 or more, with red, white, and blue ribbons in their hair and otherwise on their persons. They waved white handkerchiefs and little flags at us, and looked their sweetest. And didn't we cheer them? Well, I should say so. We stood up in the wagons and swung our caps and just whooped and hurrahed as long as those girls were in sight. We always treasured this incident as a bright, precious link in the chain of memory, for it was the last public manifestation of this nature. We arrived at Alton about sundown, and at once marched aboard the big side-wheel steamboat City of Alton, which was lying at the wharf waiting for us, and guards were promptly stationed to prevent the men leaving the boat. Our boat had hardly got moored to the wharf before the word went round that some Confederate prisoners were on the transport on our right, and we forthwith rushed to that side to get our first look at the "Secesh," as we then called them. It was only a small batch, about 100 or so. They were under guard, and on the after part of the lower deck, along the sides and the stern of the boat. We ascertained that they were about the last installment of the Fort Donelson prisoners, and were being shipped to a northern military prison. Naturally, we scanned them with great curiosity, and the boys soon began to joke and chaff them in a perfectly good-natured way. They took this silently, with no other manifestation than an occasional dry grin. But finally a rather good-looking young fellow cocked his eyes toward us, and in a soft, drawling tone called out, "You all will sing a different tune by next summer." Our boys responded to this with bursts of laughter and some derisive whoops, but later we found out that the young Confederate soldier was a true prophet, and found that our boat was moored to the wharf at St. Louis. We soon debarked and marched out to Benton Barracks, which were clear out of town and beyond the suburbs. The shape of Benton Barracks, as I now remember, was a big oblong square. We remained at Benton Barracks about 4 weeks. Life there was monotonous and void of any special interest. We drilled but little, as I now remember, the reason for that being it rained the most of the time we were there, and the drill grounds were oceans of mud. The drainage was wretched, and most of the rain that fell stayed on the surface until the ground soaked it up. And how it did rain at Benton Barracks in March, 1862. One day, while strolling around the grounds sightseeing, I fell in with a soldier who said he belonged to the 14th Wisconsin Infantry. He was some years older than me, but was quite sociable, and seemed to be a sensible, intelligent fellow. He was full of talk about his regiment, said they were nearly all young men, big stalwart lumbermen from the pine woods of Wisconsin, and urged me to come around some evening when they were on dress parade and look at them. I had found out by this time that almost every soldier would brag about his regiment, so allowance was made for what he said. But he excited my curiosity to see those Wisconsin boys, so one evening, when I was at liberty, I did go and view them while they were on dress parade, and found that the soldier had not exaggerated. They were great tall fellows, broad across the shoulders and chest, with big limbs. Altogether they simply were, from a physical standpoint, the finest looking soldiers I ever saw during my entire term of service. I speak now of this incident and of these men for the reason that later I may say something more about this 14th Wisconsin. While at Benton Barracks we were given our regimental number, 61st, and thenceforth the regiment was known and designated as the 61st Illinois Infantry. We also drew our guns. We were furnished with the Austrian rifle musket. It was of medium length, with a light brown walnut stock, and was a wicked shooter. At that time the most of the Western troops were armed with foreign-made muskets, imported from Europe. Many regiments had old Belgian muskets, a heavy, cumbersome piece, and awkward and unsatisfactory every way. We were glad to get the Austrians, and were quite proud of them. We used these until June 1863, when we turned them in and drew in lieu thereof the Springfield rifle musket of the model of 1863. It was not as heavy as the Austrian, was neater looking, and a very efficient firearm. No further change was made, and we carried the Springfield thenceforth until we were mustered out. On March 25th we left Benton Barracks for the front. We marched through St. Louis and on to the steamboat that day, but from some cause I never knew, the boat did not leave the wharf until about dark the next evening. My company was quartered on the hurricane deck of the boat. Soon after the boat started down the river, an incident befell me that looks somewhat comical now, but at the time it was to me a serious matter, and one that troubled my conscience a good deal. I had piled my knapsack, with the blanket strapped on the outside, and my other stuff at the foot of the gun stack, which included my musket. Suddenly I discovered, to my great consternation, that my blanket was gone. Yes, my lords and gentlemen, some false Scot had deliberately and feloniously appropriated my indispensable equipment for a night's repose. And a long, raw March night was coming on, and the damp and chilly air was rising like a fog from the cold surface of the river. All signs, too, portended a rainy night. The thunder was muttering off in the southwest, intermittent flashes of lightning lit up the sky, and scattering drops of rain were even then beginning to patter on the hurricane deck and ripple the bosom of the stream. What should I do? I must have a blanket, that was certain, but all my life the belief had been instilled into me that stealing was well nigh the most disgraceful of all crimes, and that a thief was a most odious and contemptible wretch. Moreover, one of the 10 Commandments pointedly declared, "Thou shalt not steal." But something had to be done, and speedily. At last it occurred to me that, being a soldier, and belonging for the time being to Uncle Sam, I was a species of government property, which it was my duty to protect at all hazards. That settled the question, and conscience and honesty withdrew. Without going into the demoralizing details, suffice to say that I stole a blanket from some hapless victim belonging to another company, and thus safeguarded the health and military efficiency of a chattel of the nation. How the other fellow got along I don't know. I made no impertinent inquiries, and during the daytime indefinitely thereafter kept that blanket in my knapsack, carefully concealed from prying eyes. But it will be recorded here that this was the only act of downright larceny that I committed during my entire term of service, except the gobbling of a couple of onions, which maybe I'll mention later. We arrived at Pittsburgh Landing on the evening of March 31st, about sundown. On going into camp in our position upon the line, for the first time in our service we dwelt in tents. We had what was called the Sibley tent, an affair of a conical shape, rather large, and capable of accommodating about 12 men with their accoutrements. As a circumstance bearing on our ignorance of life in tents, I will say that we neglected to ditch around them, and on the very first night we slept in them there came a heavy rain, and the next morning found us lying more or less in the water, and our blankets and other stuff sopping wet. But after that, on pitching our tents, one of the first things we did was to dig around them a sufficient ditch with a lateral extension. The Battle of Shiloh was fought on April 6th and 7th. In 1890 I wrote an article on the battle which was published in the New York Tribune, and later it appeared in several other newspapers. It has also been reprinted in book form in connection with papers by other persons, some about the war and others of a miscellaneous nature. The piece I wrote 25 years ago is as good, I reckon, if not better, than anything on that head I can write now, so it will be set out here. In the Ranks at Shiloh, by Leander Stillwell, late First Lieutenant, 61st Illinois Volunteer Infantry. On our arrival, we were assigned to the division of General B. M. Prentiss, and we at once marched out and went into camp. About half a mile from the landing the road forks. The main Corinth road goes to the right, past Shiloh Church. The other goes to the left. These two roads come together again some miles out. General Prentiss's division was camped on this left-hand road at right angles to it. Our regiment went into camp almost on the extreme left of Prentiss's line. There was a brigade of Sherman's division under General Stuart still further to the left, about a mile, I think, in camp near a ford of Lick Creek, where the Hamburg and Purdy road crosses the creek, and between the left of Prentiss's and General Stuart's camp there were no troops. I know that, for during the few days intervening between our arrival and the battle, I roamed all through those woods on our left between us and Stuart, hunting for wild onions and turkey peas. The camp of our regiment was about 2 miles from the landing. The tents were pitched in the woods, and there was a little field of about 20 acres in our front. The camp faced nearly west, or possibly southwest. And then the climate was delightful. We had just left the bleak, frozen north, where all was cold and cheerless, and we found ourselves in a clime where the air was as soft and warm as it was in Illinois in the latter part of May. The green grass was springing from the ground, the Johnny-jump-ups were in blossom, the trees were bursting into leaf, and the woods were full of feathered songsters. There was a redbird that would come every morning about sunup and perch himself in the tall black oak tree in our company street, and for perhaps an hour he would practice on his impatient, querulous note that said, as plain as a bird could say, "Boys, boys, get up, get up, get up." It became a standing remark among the boys that he was a Union redbird and had enlisted in our regiment to sound the reveille. So the time passed pleasantly away until that eventful Sunday morning, April 6, 1862. According to the Tribune Almanac for that year, the sun rose that morning in Tennessee at 38 minutes past 5 o'clock. I had no watch, but I have always been of the opinion that the sun was fully an hour and a half high before the fighting began on our part of the line. We had turned out about sunup, answered to roll call, and had cooked and eaten our breakfast. We had then gone to work preparing for the regular Sunday morning inspection, which would take place at 9 o'clock. The boys were scattered around the company streets and in front of the company parade grounds, engaged in polishing and brightening their muskets, and brushing up and cleaning their shoes, jackets, trousers, and clothing generally. It was a most beautiful morning. The sun was shining brightly through the trees, and there was not a cloud in the sky. It really seemed like Sunday in the country at home. But this morning was strangely still. The wagons were silent, the mules were peacefully munching their hay, and the army teamsters were giving us a rest. I listened with delight to the plaintive, mournful tones of a turtle-dove in the woods close by, while on the dead limb of a tall tree right in the camp, a woodpecker was sounding his long roll, just as I had heard it beaten by his northern brothers 1,000 times on the trees in the Otter Creek bottom at home. Suddenly, away off on the right, in the direction of Shiloh Church, came a dull, heavy pum, then another, and still another. Every man sprung to his feet, as if struck by an electric shock, and we looked inquiringly into one another's faces. "What is that?" asked everyone, but no one answered. Those heavy booms then came thicker and faster, and just a few seconds after we heard that first dull, ominous growl off to the southwest, came a low, sullen, continuous roar. There was no mistaking that sound. That was not a squad of pickets emptying their guns on being relieved from duty. It was the continuous roll of thousands of muskets, and told us that a battle was on. What I have been describing just now occurred during a few seconds only, and with the roar of musketry the long roll began to beat in our camp. Then ensued a scene of desperate haste, the like of which I certainly had never seen before, nor ever saw again. I remember that in the midst of this terrible uproar and confusion, while the boys were buckling on their cartridge boxes, and before even the companies had been formed, a mounted staff officer came galloping wildly down the line from the right. He checked and whirled his horse sharply around, right in our company street, the iron-bound hoofs of his steed crashing among the tin plates lying in a little pile where my mess had eaten its breakfast that morning. The horse was flecked with foam, and its eyes and nostrils were red as blood. The officer cast one hurried glance around him and exclaimed, "My God! This regiment not in line yet! They have been fighting on the right over an hour!" And wheeling his horse, he disappeared in the direction of the colonel's tent. Well, the companies were formed. We marched out on the regimental parade ground, and the regiment was formed in line. The command was given, "Load at will, load." We had anticipated this, however, as the most of us had instinctively loaded our guns before we had formed company. All this time the roar on the right was getting nearer and louder. Our old colonel rode up close to us, opposite the center of the regimental line, and called out, "Attention, battalion!" We fixed our eyes on him to hear what was coming. It turned out to be the old man's battle harangue. "Gentlemen," he said, in a voice that every man in the regiment heard, "remember your state and do your duty today like brave men." Immediately after the colonel had given us his brief exhortation, the regiment was marched across the little field I have before mentioned, and we took our place in line of battle, the woods in front of us and the open field in our rear. We dressed on the colors, ordered arms, and stood awaiting the attack. By this time the roar on the right had become terrific. The rebel army was unfolding its front, and the battle was steadily advancing in our direction. We could begin to see the blue rings of smoke curling upward among the trees off to the right, and the pungent smell of burning gunpowder filled the air. As the roar came traveling down the line from the right, it reminded me, only it was a million times louder, of the sweep of a thunder shower in summertime over the hard ground of a stubble field. And there we stood, on the edge of the woods, so still, waiting for the storm to break on us. I know mighty well what I was thinking about then. My mind's eye was fixed on a little log cabin far away to the north, in the backwoods of western Illinois. I could see my father sitting on the porch, reading the little local newspaper brought from the post office the evening before. There was my mother getting my little brothers ready for Sunday school, the old dog lying asleep in the sun, the hens cackling about the barn. All these things and 100 other tender recollections rushed into my mind. I am not ashamed to say now that I would willingly have given a general quitclaim deed for every jot and title of military glory falling to me, past, present, and to come, if I only could have been miraculously and instantaneously set down in the yard of that peaceful little home, 1,000 miles away from the haunts of fighting men. The time we thus stood, waiting the attack, could not have exceeded 5 minutes. Suddenly, obliquely to our right, there was a long, wavy flash of bright light, then another and another. It was the sunlight shining on gun barrels and bayonets, and there they were at last, a long brown line with muskets at a right shoulder shift, in excellent order. Right through the woods they came. We began firing at once. From one end of the regiment to the other leaped a sheet of red flame, and the roar that went up from the edge of that old field doubtless advised General Prentiss of the fact that the rebels had at last struck the extreme left of his line. We had fired but 2 or 3 rounds when, for some reason, I never knew what, we were ordered to fall back across the field, and did so. The whole line, so far as I could see to the right, went back. We halted on the other side of the field, in the edge of the woods in front of our tents, and again began firing. The rebels, of course, had moved up and occupied the line we had just abandoned, and here we did our first hard fighting during the day. Our officers said after the battle was over that we held this line an hour and 10 minutes. How long it was I do not know. I took no note of time. We retreated from this position, as our officers afterwards said, because the troops on our right had given way, and we were flanked. Possibly those boys on our right would give the same excuse for their leaving, and probably truly too. Still, I think we did not fall back a minute too soon. As I rose from the comfortable log from behind which a bunch of us had been firing, I saw men in gray and brown clothes, with trailed muskets, running through the camp on our right, and I saw something else, too, that sent a chill all through me. It was a kind of flag I had never seen before. It was a gaudy sort of thing, with red bars. It flashed over me in a second that that thing was a rebel flag. It was not more than 60 yards to the right. The smoke around it was low and dense and kept me from seeing the man who was carrying it, but I plainly saw the banner. It was going fast with a jerky motion, which told me that the bearer was on a double quick. About that time we left. We observed no kind of order in leaving. The main thing was to get out of there as quick as we could. I ran down our company street, and in passing the big Sibley tent of our mess, I thought of my knapsack, with all my traps and belongings, including that precious little packet of letters from home. I said to myself, I will save my knapsack anyhow. But one quick backward glance over my left shoulder made me change my mind, and I went on. I never saw my knapsack or any of its contents afterwards. Our broken forces halted and reformed about half a mile to the rear of our camp on the summit of a gentle ridge, covered with thick brush. I recognized our regiment by the little gray pony the old colonel rode, and hurried to my place in the ranks. Standing there with our faces once more to the front, I saw a seemingly endless column of men in blue marching by the flank, who were filing off to the right through the woods, and I heard our old German adjutant, Kramer, say to the colonel, "Those are the troops of General Hurlbut. He is forming a new line there in the bush." I exclaimed to myself from the bottom of my heart, "Bully for General Hurlbut and the new line in the bush. Maybe we'll whip 'em yet." I shall never forget my feelings about this time. I was astonished at our first retreat in the morning across the field back to our camp, but it occurred to me that maybe that was only strategy, and all done on purpose. But when we had to give up our camp and actually turn our backs and run half a mile, it seemed to me that we were forever disgraced, and I kept thinking to myself, what will they say about this at home? I was very dry for a drink, and as we were doing nothing just then, I slipped out of ranks and ran down to the little hollow in our rear in search of water. Finding a little pool, I threw myself on the ground and took a copious draught. As I rose to my feet, I observed an officer about a rod above me, also quenching his thirst, holding his horse meanwhile by the bridle. As he rose, I saw it was our old adjutant. At no other time would I have dared accost him unless in the line of duty, but the situation made me bold. "Adjutant," I said, "what does this mean? Our having to run this way? Ain't we whipped?" He blew the water from his mustache, and quickly answered in a careless way, "Oh, no, that is all right. We used to fall back to form on the reserve. General Buell was now crossing the river mit 50,000 men, and will be here pretty quick. And General Lew Wallace is coming from Crump's Landing mit 15,000 more. Wie whips 'em, wie whips 'em. Go to your company." Back I went on the run, with a heart as light as a feather. As I took my place in the ranks beside my chum, Jack Medford, I said to him, "Jack, I've just had a talk with the old adjutant down at the branch where I've been to get a drink. He says Buell is crossing the river with 75,000 men and a whole world of cannon, and that some other general is coming up from Crump's Landing with 25,000 more men. He says we fell back here on purpose, and that we're going to whip the Secesh, just sure. Ain't that just perfectly bully?" I had improved some on the adjutant's figures, as the news was so glorious I thought a little variance of 25,000 or 30,000 men would make no difference in the end. But as the long hours wore on that day, and still Buell and Wallace did not come, my faith in the adjutant's veracity became considerably shaken. It was at this point that my regiment was detached from Prentice's division and served with it no more that day. We were sent some distance to the right to support a battery, the name of which I never learned. It was occupying the summit of a slope, and was actively engaged when we reached it. We were put in position about 20 rods in the rear of the battery and ordered to lie flat on the ground. The ground sloped gently down in our direction, so that by hugging it close the rebel shot and shell went over us. It was here at about 10 o'clock in the morning that I first saw Grant that day. He was on horseback, of course, accompanied by his staff, and was evidently making a personal examination of his lines. He went by us in a gallop, riding between us and the battery at the head of his staff. The battery was then hotly engaged. Shot and shell were whizzing overhead and cutting off the limbs of trees, but Grant rode through the storm with perfect indifference, seemingly paying no more attention to the missiles than if they had been paper wads. We remained in support of this battery until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We were then put in motion by the right flank, filed to the left, crossed the left-hand Corinth road, then we were thrown into the line by the command, "By the left flank, march." We crossed a little ravine and up a slope, and relieved a regiment on the left of Hurlbut's line. This line was desperately engaged, and had been at this point, as we afterward learned, for fully 4 hours. I remember as we went up the slope and began firing, about the first thing that met my gaze was what out west we would call a windrow of dead men in blue, some doubled up face downward, others with their white faces upturned to the sky, brave boys who had been shot to death in holding the line. Here we stayed until our last cartridge was shot away. We were then relieved by another regiment. We filled our cartridge boxes again and went back to the support of our battery. The boys laid down and talked in low tones. Many of our comrades, alive and well an hour ago, we had left dead on that bloody ridge. And still the battle raged. From right to left, everywhere, it was one never-ending, terrible roar with no prospect of stopping. Somewhere between 4 and 5 o'clock, as near as I can tell, everything became ominously quiet. Our battery ceased firing. The gunners leaned against the pieces and talked and laughed. Suddenly a staff officer rode up and said something in a low tone to the commander of the battery, then rode to our colonel and said something to him. The battery horses were at once brought up from a ravine in the rear, and the battery limbered up and moved off through the woods diagonally to the left and rear. We were put in motion by the flank and followed it. Everything kept so still, the loudest noise I heard was the clucking of the wheels of the gun carriages and caissons as they wound through the woods. We emerged from the woods and entered a little old field. I then saw to our right and front lines of men in blue moving in the same direction we were, and it was evident that we were falling back. All at once, on the right, the left, and from our recent front came one tremendous roar, and the bullets fell like hail. The lines took the double quick towards the rear. For a while the attempt was made to fall back in order, and then everything went to pieces. My heart failed me utterly. I thought the day was lost. A confused mass of men and guns, caissons, army wagons, ambulances, and all the debris of a beaten army surged and crowded along the narrow dirt road to the landing, while that pitiless storm of leaden hail came crashing on us from the rear. It was undoubtedly at this crisis in our affairs that the division of General Prentice was captured. It must have been when we were less than half a mile from the landing on our disorderly retreat before mentioned that we saw, standing in line of battle, at ordered arms, extending from both sides of the road until lost in sight in the woods, a long, well-ordered line of men in blue. What did that mean, and where had they come from? I was walking by the side of Enoch Wallace, the orderly sergeant of my company. He was a man of nerve and courage, and by word and deed had done more that day to hold us green and untried boys in ranks and firmly to our duty than any other man in the company. But even he, in the face of this seemingly appalling state of things, had evidently lost heart. I said to him, "Enoch, what are those men there for?" He answered in a low tone, "I guess they are put there to hold the rebels in check till the army can get across the river." And doubtless that was the thought of every intelligent soldier in our beaten column. And yet it goes to show how little the common soldier knew of the actual situation. We did not know then that this line was the last line of battle of the fighting 4th Division under General Hurlbut, that on its right was the division of McClellan, the Fort Donelson boys, that on its right, at right angles to it, and as it were the refused wing of the army, was glorious old Sherman hanging on with a bulldog grip to the road across Snake Creek from Crump's Landing, by which Lew Wallace was coming with 5,000 men. In other words, we still had an unbroken line confronting the enemy, made up of men who were not yet ready by any manner of means to give up that they were whipped. Nor did we know then that our retreating mass consisted only of some regiments of Hurlbut's division and some other isolated commands, who had not been duly notified of the recession of Hurlbut and of his falling back to form a new line, and thereby came very near sharing the fate of Prentice's men and being marched to the rear as prisoners of war. Speaking for myself, it was 20 years after the battle before I found these things out, yet they are true, just as much so as the fact that the sun rose yesterday morning. Well, we filed through Hurlbut's line, halted, reformed, and faced to the front once more. We were put in place a short distance in the rear of Hurlbut as a support to some heavy guns. It must have been about 5 o'clock now. Suddenly, on the extreme left and just a little above the landing, came a deafening explosion that fairly shook the ground beneath our feet, followed by others in quick and regular succession. The look of wonder and inquiry that the soldiers' faces wore for a moment disappeared for one of joy and exultation as it flashed across our minds that the gunboats had at last joined hands in the dance and were pitching big 20-pound Parrott shells up the ravine in front of Hurlbut, to the terror and discomfiture of our adversaries. The last place my regiment assumed was close to the road coming up from the landing. As we were lying there, I heard the strains of martial music and saw a body of men marching by the flank up the road. I slipped out of ranks and walked out to the side of the road to see what troops they were. Their band was playing Dixie's Land, and playing it well. The men were marching at a quick step, carrying their guns, cartridge boxes, haversacks, canteens, and blanket rolls. I saw that they had not been in the fight, for there was no powder smoke on their faces. "What regiment is this?" I asked of a young sergeant marching on the flank. Back came the answer in a quick, cheery tone: "The 36th Indiana, the advance guard of Buell's army." My account of the battle is about done. So far as I saw or heard, very little fighting was done that evening after Buell's advance crossed the river. The sun must have been fully an hour high when anything like regular and continuous firing had entirely ceased. What the result would have been if Beauregard had massed his troops on our left and forced the fighting late Sunday evening would be a matter of opinion, and a common soldier's opinion would not be considered worth much. My regiment was held in reserve the next day, and was not engaged. I have, therefore, no personal experience of that day to relate. After the Battle of Shiloh, it fell to my lot to play my humble part in several other fierce conflicts of arms, but Shiloh was my maiden fight. It was there I first saw a gun fired in anger, heard the whistle of a bullet, or saw a man die a violent death, and my experiences, thoughts, impressions, and sensations on that bloody Sunday will abide with me as long as I live.